adults. But yours is a little bit harder, I think. All right, so part of theology is that we're able to defend against statements and understand what they can mean. So I'm going to say a phrase, and you say whether or not you think it's biblical, and you can raise your hand or whatever. Okay, so the first statement is that I believe in God. Is that biblical? What do you think? I believe in God. Is that biblical?
Yeah.
Okay. How about I believe in Jesus Christ? Is that biblical?
Yeah.
How about I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way of salvation? Is that biblical? How about this? Salvation is by grace through faith in Christ alone. Is that biblical?
Yeah.
How would you like to know that a Catholic can say every single one of those phrases? Even the last one. Because I believe it says salvation is through grace, is by grace through faith in Christ alone, is actually written in the Second Vatican Council. So we have to define terms, don't we? We have to understand. When we talk to people, we find out what they believe. So all of those are biblical if what they understand comes from the Scriptures. Hopefully that's what this class is going to do, is we're going to help build up what the Scriptures say. I want you to ask questions if you have questions. I use a lot of terminology. It's just natural for me, especially when we're teaching systematic theology. I don't do it with kids on Wednesdays. But if I slip into that, please just raise your hand. If you don't understand something, raise your hand. You just take my top sheet?
He might put it on the bottom.
Sorry.
Okay, whoa. So I just want, please, just go ahead and raise your hand. First is, we want to lay a groundwork for what's called bibliology. Bibliology is a systematic theological term, meaning everything that the Bible has to say about itself. And there are categories within the study of the Bible with regards to itself that actually help us to sort of have the same mindset. The whole point of this is that we know that strong churches and strong believers come from having a foundation of truth in their head and in their heart, something they're devoted to. We know that churches split and divisions exist, not primarily because of what people believe, different doctrines, but that when they come to those different doctrines, we actually find that they hold on to different sources of authority, whether it's experience, or whether it's philosophy, or they may mixed in a little bit of scriptures, or sometimes it's just they would say, oh, it's just my common sense and that's just the way the world is. And there's a lot of other potential sources of authority. We're going to get into that maybe today. But what happens is that a lot of times we, from our heart, God is consistently exposing to us and through us to what do we really submit to, right? And when we say we believe, that's really what we're getting down to, is to what are we devoted to in our life? What are we loyal to? What are we loyal to? And actually the word we're going to learn later when we study soteriology, which is the study of salvation, that the word faith also has the understanding of loyal in it, loyalty. But we're going to sort of go back over authority. And I gave this definition for authority last week, and I'm going to repeat it today, and it might be on your outline. If not, it's the definition at the top. The right or power to command, rule, influence, or reign over a sphere, to commit resources, give orders with an expectation of obedience, to interpret, and to judge. And to judge would also include the execution of sentence, if it were in the case of a legal pronouncement. From all of that, does authority exist? And in our society, there's sort of a debate about whether or not authority exists. We actually act more like authority doesn't exist than we actually say that it is. Americans have a tendency from our culture to question authority. And not just to question authority, but to establish our own. You can see it in the way that our churches are structured. You can see it in the way society is generally headed anyway. And we know from a fact that even from the scriptures, and we talked about this last week, that mankind in his heart generally wants to become his own authority. He doesn't want to submit to anybody else except to himself. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, and he establishes himself as God. Well, the ultimate reality of that is man becomes his own authority, the individual. And then, of course, then you have two individuals who think their own authority, and what's going to happen, right? And then we get sort of a breakdown of society and the lack of the image of God and murder and violence. We're going to get into that today, I think. So does authority exist? We answered this last week from, we can actually see that authority does exist, and we can see it around us in the visible realm. And I covered some of these. We can see that it's as man in relation to himself, the individual. We can see that in occupations, when a person becomes skilled in something, they actually become an authority over that, being able to manipulate material, but they have that within them. Physical activity, whether boxing, they learn skills, skilled labor, also in behavior. The idea of self-control is really the ability to have authority over your own thoughts and heart. Okay? Now, we're not getting into Christian understanding of that just yet, but just saying that authority over yourself, being able to control what you do and what you think and how you feel and what you say, like from James 3:2, those all show that authority does, or at least should, exist, and with their expectations. We also have, there's evidence for, that authority exists between men individually. Roles exist on certain levels that show that these are within just how God created things. From the principle of life. In other words, is that there's authority between two individuals where you're not permitted to take someone else's life and murder. It's forbidden, and that was both before the fall and after the fall. Murder was forbidden. The principle of possessions. In other words, what another person owns, that's theirs, or what's associated with them, and that includes, we got from Exodus chapter 20, that would include the marriage relationship, which is the next principle. Is that's between two people, that authority exists and not to be violated. You can also have it between the principle of parents, between a single parent or two parents and a child. That's not to be violated, which it's interesting that our society has the collective view supersedes the parental view, which is that actually the scriptures put it the other way. The parents come before the government or the society, which is interesting. But notice those exist first. We see that evidence of authority exists. And we understand this from common sense, but it's good to know the scriptures lay out all that as well. And we went over some of the scriptural references last week with regards to how we can see that authority exists, man within himself, between men individually. Also, we can see that authority exists between men corporately, between whether it's a person in a group or between two groups. And you can see it in how it can be, whether it's based upon age. You have evidence of age-based authority, where in 1 Timothy 5 and 1 Timothy 4, you have commands given by the Apostle Paul to Timothy about not rebuking those that are older men or older women, but to treat them appropriately based upon their age. Notice it doesn't say spiritual condition, it just says their age. Because there's an authority that exists. In fact, we know from the Old Testament, from the Proverbs, that reaching a certain age has a certain amount of respect attached to it. And that's because there's a certain authority related to age. Okay? Even with just a collection of life experience, regardless of whether or not there's absolute, perfect, whatever, wisdom that comes with it, with age comes respect. On the other hand, there's also, you don't want to go the opposite extreme and say that youth have no respect either, and that's also age-based respect. There's a principle between the church and Christ. In other words, our head and the entire church corporately or locally. You have it from Ephesians 5:23 and 24. Christ is the head of the church. We understand this. In other words, the head of this church is Christ. The head of the church universally across the world is Christ himself. We also see this in the principle of government. This is from Romans 13, 1 and 2. I want you to go ahead and turn there. In our society, this one sort of irks us the most, given whatever political climate winds are blowing at the time. And I just want to put a little background to Romans 13, 1 and 2, is that when the Apostle Paul wrote this, remember, he was writing to those who were in Rome underneath wicked Caesars. Tiberius, most likely at the time of this writing, around AD 55. So every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. That's the founding principle. And those which are established, notice it doesn't say democracy, it doesn't say republic. He's talking about a wicked person, Caesar, right? Who is, by the way, and that was the cult, the worship of the emperor. Right? They actually collected tax money to build temples to Caesar. They also use tax money to create an army to suppress them. And from that, here's what he says, is that there are no authorities except from God, and those which exist, however they are established by God. Notice? And this was their purpose. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Notice. So we see that a man or a group, in this case Romans, the Church of Rome, or the church that was in Rome, was underneath the governmental authority, which were wicked, but that was established by God. But you can see that authority exists. We understand this in our society. We as Christians are underneath a government which is becoming more and more oppressive, more and more hostile to Christianity, and more corrupt within itself, right? Voting and whatever. But it doesn't matter, it's established by God. And we can get some reasons later, but we just want to see it exists. You can also see it, again, look at 1 Peter 2. Just in case you think it's only Paul saying this, let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Again, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Again, Peter is writing at a time when you're still under Roman occupation and Roman wickedness, and a style of government which today we would just balk at, But he still says, do it. In fact, here's the thing: is we always say, what is the will of God? Very clear statement. For such is the will of God, that we submit to the government. Now, we're not going to get into when you don't submit. That's not the purpose. But we see that at this point, authority exists in government, between us and the government. And the government has an authority over us that was given by God. Okay? And we'll talk about its limitations much later, but right now it exists. We can also see that in Jesus' answer, just in case we don't want to listen to the apostles, let's listen to Jesus. We know this, that even to the point of rendering our resources to an authority that is wicked. Think about that. We see the evidence that there is an authority in government that God has established over us, even if those resources are used for wicked purposes. Now, turn to Matthew. This is from Christ, Matthew 22:21. We know this answer very, very well. Matthew 22:21. First part of the verse. This is, of course, the major trap they tried to get Jesus in to make him at odds with the people. Right? They actually counseled together on what was the best question they could ask him for Jesus to lose his popularity with the people. We can see that it was a consortium of political influences and religious influences getting together for the first time. They hated each other, and they're getting together with this question: is, should we give a tribute to Caesar? And what does Jesus answer? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. What is he talking about? What are the things that are Caesar's? Well, in the context, it's the poll tax. And the poll tax was used, again, for the occupation of the army, to suppress Judea. It was for the building of Roman temples, which, by the way, Caesarea is called Caesarea because it was named after Caesar, and they were emblems of worship of the Roman cult there. So yet we see evidence exists where the government, even though wicked, has the authority, and my definition of authority was to commit resources, to command resources. And Jesus is saying, give them the money. Let them go do what they want. It doesn't matter. You still give to God what's God's. There's still that authority. All right. We can see that authority exists between a person or a group individual in the principle of shepherding. This is from 1 Thessalonians 5:12. This is very early in the writings of the New Testament. This is from the Apostle Paul. Just a little background on 1 Thessalonians, where there was sort of an overexplosion of a lack of understanding of spiritual gifts and how soon Jesus was coming back, and so they stopped working, and there were some divisions in the church, and people were sort of going all over the place, and you had a group that said, let's just stop everything and not allow anything in the church. We're just going to come in with a heavy hand and stop all spiritual gifts. And and Paul gives the request, we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction. Notice, there are leaders in the church who have charge over you. There's an authority that has been granted unto them by Christ to a certain degree, and the primary means of that is what follows, and give you instruction. Later on, it also says in Hebrews 13:17, not written by Paul, but much later, it says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Notice, obey your leaders and submit to them. Does it say they're perfect? No, but it does say obey them. And because why? They're keeping watch over your soul. That's their function. How about Peter? 1 Peter 5:1-3. Therefore I exhort the elders among you. So Peter is writing to elders, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you. Elders, shepherd the flock. Exercising oversight. In other words, what is oversight? That's sort of a leadership, not under compulsion. In other words, it's not because someone made you voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain. Don't do it for money, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge. Notice, lording it over. That was the word where you come in with a heavy hand of leadership. But again, we can see the principle of shepherding includes an authority. Includes an authority. The principle of employment, we talked about this last week. And again, I'm stretching this a little bit. We understand that the relationship between slaves and masters is not exactly employment, but the principles are the same for us. Okay? Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, is Ephesians 6:5, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. If we have an employer, they have an authority over us to command our time for us to do what they tell us to do in the workplace. Right? Simple. I have a job, I have to work within a certain time limit each day, I have to give a service during that time, and my employer expects me to and commands me to do certain activities during that time, not to do something else. Same with you. We can see that in masters, of course, it's do the same things and give up threatening. So here it's interesting that Paul wants to throw in that authority is limited. But again, we can see in our own experience, but also from the scriptures, that authority exists between us with the principle of employment. Now, there's also authority between man and creation. This was a theological point we made last week. I don't know if everyone got. But mankind is designed as having authority over the created realm. Genesis 1:28 says this is in the original design prior to the fall. Here's the command that God gave in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, we won't get into it now, but the idea of image of God, of what it includes. Mankind, as bearer of the image of God, part of the image, in other words, what separates mankind from everything else in creation is that in the image we have is the command to rule or reign over creation. Think about that. What separates mankind in bearing the image of God, in other words, is we show what God is like when we reign over creation. That's what it means. Okay? Filling the earth was the command so that the entire earth would be filled with the glory of God. And mankind is part of that. Right? All the rest of creation was instantly filled, except for mankind. There were only two. Then you get the command to multiply, fill it, and in the filling, notice it's reign over it and subdue it. So we can see that mankind has it in the design of God to have authority over creation. Now, we can also see this command is repeated in Genesis 9:1-7. Now, it doesn't specifically say rule over. But there's a little, I want to give you a little something from the Hebrew. Genesis 9:1-7 begins and ends with the same phrase. It's the be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply upon it. That is called an inclusio. An inclusio. It's the hermeneutical term. Hermeneutics means it's a device, it's a literary device to help stimulate memory. Okay? Noah knew of the commands given to Adam. We can talk about that at a different time, orally. He's actually not that separate. He's a lot of years away, but not many generations away from Adam. and you have this be fruitful and multiply command given twice, and the idea of that is to give a literary, because God is speaking this, to stimulate the memory of the original. In other words, he doesn't have to repeat verbatim everything from the original, which is Genesis 1:28. The design is so that everything that was included there is repeated. And the difference, though, the reason why it's done twice, the difference is what's in there is post-flood, where there were some differences as far as animals now fearing us because of the curse of God's judgment. But the point is that we have authority to reign over creation even after the fall and after the curse of God upon the earth through the flood. The authority, even though it's marred, we can see it how we might abuse the earth or abuse animals, which, by the way, it's given in Leviticus on what you're not supposed to do to your beasts of burden. It's amazing that that's happened to be given. But the thing is that the reign and ruling of creation is still there. We still know that. You can see it from the curse in Genesis 3:14 and 17 to 19, is that we reign over creation so much so that regardless of what we become as an image of the bearer of God, is that creation is cursed on account of us. In other words, it's not that creation went astray and then mankind was cursed because creation went astray. It's mankind sinned and all creation is cursed because of him. Okay? And then in the future, this is the next point, we can see the authority of mankind over creation in that creation will not be changed, ultimately, until mankind is redeemed. I don't mean redeemed individually. I mean glorified. Set up into the kind of final glorification body that they're going to have, right? The new heavens and the new earth will happen sequentially after mankind is resurrected and glorified with a new physical body. That's when it's going to happen, not before. And that's linked to man. And that's because it shows man's authority over creation. Okay? That's the way God has designed it. And you can see that, by the way, in Romans 8:19 through 21. The creation is groaning to be released from its corruption to futility. It was placed there not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. In other words, is God subjected creation to mankind's authority, and when man fell, now creation is in vain trying to show the glory of God. And we talked about this last week, is that as much as the heavens declare the glory of God, it's still cursed, and it's in vain doing it. It's not doing it the way that God originally designed it because of the fall. Okay? Now, we also finally see, again, that it's in the visible realm. This is just a statement from James in James 3:7. And this was, he's just making a statement about, it's really about the tongue, but he's showing mankind's authority over creation. This is what he says. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, by the human race. And we understand this. He's making a statement of how history has flown, or shown that man has generally showed his reigning and ruling over creation by taking control of creation. We can see this on how we take care of gardens or beasts, and how we cultivate, and how we put them in zoos, and how we control them and push them out in whatever way. Mankind shows his authority over creation. Okay, that was last week. Now we have this week. In the invisible realm, in other words, it's what we can't see, there's also authority. Okay? This means that in the invisible spiritual realm, which includes both the created angelic beings and the uncreated, namely God himself. In other words, you can't see angels, and you can't see God unless he manifests himself. But you have then an authority that exists between the two. Okay? Now, what else is, first of all, is in the invisible realm is man in relation to sin. There's an authority that exists between man and sin. And guess which side of the authority structure you're on? You're underneath sin if you're not a Christian.
Right.
Okay? Notice what I just said. You're underneath sin if you're not a Christian. In fact, sin dominates. Sin is master over man individually. Genesis 4:7. I want us to read this. Please turn to Genesis 4:7. Now by the way, we're going to get into this much later in a study called hamartiology. Hamartia is the Greek word for sin, hamartia. So hamartiology is the study of sin. We're going to get into that in much more detail when we get into that study, which is going to be coming. But right now, we want to see that sin has authority over men, a man individually. Genesis 4:7. This is God talking to Cain. Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, that word desire is only used twice in all of Hebrew. It's when God curses the woman and says, your desire will be for your husband, but he will what? Rule over you. Here, notice, desire and rule are in parallel. Here it's again to Cain. Sin's desire is for you, but you must what? Master it. It's a conflict of authority. What's the reason for the conflict of the sexes? Easy. It's the curse. It's a struggle for authority. It's not that she has feelings for you. No, it's that the curse upon the woman is that she's going to, generally in the history of mankind, is women are going to struggle against the authority of a man, of her husband, or men generally. And generally in the flow of history is men will brutally suppress women through whatever means, physical strength or whatever. Doesn't mean that's the way it's supposed to be, it means the way it was. But here, sin's desire, the suppression of authority, is over you, but you must master it. Of course, Cain couldn't master it because he's cursed. But notice, sin is over a man individually. It's over Cain. He's talking to Cain. What about over all men? How about Romans 3:23? Everybody knows this verse? Who wants to say it before we... Oh, I have it up there. Oh, that's okay.
I'll say it.
You want to say it? Thank you.
For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
For all have
It
sinned.
means all. Nobody's left out.
That's right, all. This is not one of those all of every kind. It means all universally. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You can compare this, by the way, with Romans 6:14. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Notice, for Christians, sin does not what? Master. Master. Now that's a very strong word, then and now. Sin is the master of unbelievers. Sin is not to be the master of Christians, but it shows that there's an authority between sin as a principle and mankind universally. So that sin as the principle dominates men so that all sin. So here comes the theological statement. Men sin because they're sinners. It's not the opposite. Men are sinners because they sin. No, men sin because they are sinners. It's in their nature. The authority is over them. They cannot escape it. Right? We'll get into that later when we get into the nature of man and anthropology, the fourfold state of mankind. We'll talk about that later. We'll give you some Latin terms for you to memorize. All right, here we go. The end of sin as death applied to all men. In other words, is another way, and this is so you can get this is how the invisible authority of sin is actually experienced by every single person. Okay? This is one of your arguments on say, how do you know that sin is master over me? Here's the question. Are you going to die? The answer is yes. Death is the curse of God because mankind is under sin. Right? Here's what it says. The end of death is applied to all men. So we know that the authority of sin exists over mankind because the result of sin is death, and death is over mankind. Right? Everyone here is going to get older. Unless Jesus tarries, right, and glorifies us. But everyone's going to get older, and eventually we're all going to die and have to meet our Creator and our Judge. Okay? But death is the evidence of the invisible. Till you return to the ground. In other words, it's in the original curse, Genesis 3:19. In other words, when is the curse going to continue? And when is the person going to be released supposedly from the curse in creation? Here it is. Till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. God cursed Adam. There's the sentence of death because of sin. Everyone here is still physically under that sentence. We're all still going to die. Christians are not alleviated from it. We're not lifted from that part of the curse. We also see it theologically from Romans 5:17a, a very difficult passage. We're not going to interpret it. For if by the transgression of the one, speaking of Adam, death reigned through the one. You see that? So he says in Romans 6 that sin is master, and here death reigns through Adam. Because Adam sinned, death reigns. Is anyone going to escape the king of death, physical death? No. Even as Christians, we're all going to die unless Jesus comes back. But when we say Jesus conquered death, there's a couple of meanings for that. We're going to get into that. But we can see the principle of authority of sin over us, individually and all mankind corporately, in the sentence of death. All right. And this is actually, my daughter wanted to be in here for this one. She wanted to hear about angels, and she's going to miss it. We also see in the invisible realm of a hierarchy of authority exists between mankind, between the angels themselves, in the hierarchy of angels. Now we're just going to glance over this. We're going to get into it later in angelology, which is, guess what? The study of angels. But you can see this hierarchy exists among holy angels. Hierarchy exists amongst holy angels. Isaiah 6:22, the word for seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. Now in the context, there aren't any other listed. But seraphim is a class of angel. It's understood. It means burning ones in the Hebrew. But the idea is that there's this class of angel which were designed to be close to God for specific worship. We can see them appear again in Matthew or in Revelation. Which, by the way, it's interesting that they're called living creatures in Ezekiel, and they're the 4 living creatures around the throne in Revelation. So there's probably 4 of them. 4 of these creatures. However, and they have difficulty describing what they look like, except, with 6 wings and those things, but they have difficulty. They represent something. Go ahead.
Are the seraphim and the cherubim the same?
No. Seraphim and cherubim are two separate classes of angels.
Okay.
But the seraphim are the closest as far as their design is to worship. And interesting is, we talk about, this is a little side note, we talk about singing songs. We have that Revelation 4 about they sang a new song. Well, that's because the seraphim have been singing the same song for 800 years. From Isaiah to Revelation, when they were written, was 800 years of Revelation had passed between the two. And they were singing what song? Holy, holy, holy. How would you like to sing holy, holy, holy for 800 years with no change? They do. They do. They didn't have a problem with it. We could everyone, I need a new song. 800 years of the same song.
Like this song.
Without stopping for 800 years, because that's what God is like. Anyway, getting back to my point, sorry, a little side note. But hierarchy exists. This is a class of angels. It doesn't show their relation to other angels, but it does show that they have a particular authority related to the worship of God. These 4 living creatures were designed for a particular purpose, and no one else is going to fulfill that. They have a particular purpose. You can see this in Matthew 26:53. This is where Jesus is giving an answer about whether or not he could call to his own authority angels to come to his command. This is what he says. Or do you not think that I can appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Now, we're showing a hierarchy because the word legion is a military term. They understood this. It was a Roman military term. It meant 6,000 structured in a unit. Right? They were a fighting force. It's not a mob. There's a different word for mob. We see that entirely in the New Testament. Jesus walked through the mob or the crowd. It's not the word for legion. Here's the word for the legion. In other words, they are militarily arranged. Okay? So Jesus can call angels that have military structure. 12 of them. So they're even divided. They're not just arranged to each other, but there's 12 of them. He can call and say, I want 72,000 angels at my command. 12 of them militarily arranged, and we can go out and just boom, But he doesn't do that. Now, the point of the passage is something different, but we're showing that within the angelic realm there is hierarchical structure. Some have a military purpose, and they're arranged so. And Jesus can call them at any time. All right. You also have, finally, in Jude 9, the reference to Michael, the archangel. Now, if there were no hierarchy within the angels, how can you have an archangel? And by the way, that is not actually a translation of the word. It's a transliteration. Transliteration is they take the Greek and they give it English letters. Okay?
Like hallelujah.
Alleluia. Alleluia is a Hebrew transliteration because the word in Hebrew is hallelujah. Okay? We know a couple of these, like the word Pharisee is transliteration. Anyway, Archangel is, of course, comes from the word arch, which means reigning or ruling. It's the ruling angel. Ruling angel. In fact, he's the only angel called the archangel, which makes Jude 9 even more impressive, considering that Michael is the archangel and he's rebuking Satan. Right? You have the ruling angel. He's not rebuking Satan based upon his own authority, and that's the point of the passage. Michael had authority over Satan. But does he rebuke him? No, he goes to the Lord because it's hubris. Okay? But anyway, we're going back to the point, is in the hierarchy of the angelic realm, we see that there are legions of angels. They have military terms. We see there are special classes, and we can now see there's an archangel. So we're going to get into it later, but we can see that authority exists even in the angelic realm. God designed the angels with hierarchical structure, authority structure. We also see it in the fallen angel realm. In other words, authority just doesn't go out the window just because you have unredeemed angels. You see this Colossians 1:18. Okay? Here's what it says. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all have been created through him and for him. Now, those words, thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, they don't specifically refer to fallen angels, but it includes them. But notice there are 4 separate words, and it's not just that he's throwing words out there just because he wants to make a point. He's not just putting... Each of those words has a different understanding of authority. Thrones, dominions, or rulers of authority. There's a structure of angels, whether it's fallen or non-fallen. But if we want a specific fallen angel reference, you can go to Colossians 2:15. So this is when Christ goes down into hell and shows and makes a public display to the demons. Here's what he says. When he had disarmed, here it is, the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them. In other words, to the angels, to these fallen angels. Again, 2 separate words, rulers and authorities. There's a structure. How about Ephesians 6:12? For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Again, you have a multiplication of words, not because he just wants to make a point, but because there actually are divisions. Jesus seemed to assume this. This isn't in your syllabus. Jesus seemed to assume this when he talked about a house divided itself cannot stand. In other words, Satan has to be organized. Satan is demons. Has to be organized. Satan is the ruler of demons, right? So we know there's a hierarchical structure. We're not told specifically what it looks like. Notice, God isn't giving us revelation to say, what does that look like? We know that we can see certain elements here and there, but we can't go through and say, oh, there's this many demons. They all are arranged like so. We don't know. We know that some are we know that some are appointed for world leaders. We see that in the book of Daniel. Why was the revelation delayed? Because an angel was fighting against a demon over a world leader. Anyway, so angels in the angelic realm themselves. How about the evidence between man and angels? A very good question. Our area is Catholic, so there's sort of a misunderstanding of angels, and we know from what Pastor Avery just preached through that there was a time with a philosophy called Gnosticism from the early church, which believed that mankind can become like angels or have authority over angels. It sort of rears its head every once in a while in our philosophy that we sort of can become better than angels, and we're gonna rule over them and command them what to do, and we can sort of see it in charismatic theology today. There's a movement that believes that you can command demons with a word, and you can go out into neighborhoods and command the demons to leave, and and take over their territory. Well, here's what we have. You have the titles for Satan. He's the ruler of this world, ruler of this age, prince of the power of the air, the god of this age. Those are all very powerful titles. In other words, Satan has been granted an authority over this time and over the people. He has a kingdom, right? He has a kingdom. When he says, I can give you the kingdoms of this world, I can give to you, Jesus did not challenge that Satan could give him the kingdoms of this world. The problem was that was not the kind of kingdom that Jesus wanted. Right? All right. Anyway, man in relation to angels, Satan is a ruler. It's called a ruler, a prince of God. We also have, there's a created ascendancy of angels greater in authority than mankind. This is whether holy or fallen. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether or not the angel is holy angel or a fallen angel, they have in their nature an authority over mankind. Here we go. Psalm 8:5, you can compare this with Hebrews 2:7. That's for the holy angels. Or for fallen angels, 2 Peter 2:10, second half of the verse, that's what the B means, through 11, or Jude 8 and 9. The whole point about what Peter and Jude wrote about the hubris of these false teachers was they thought that they could just go out and blaspheme fallen angels. I'm better than Satan. Satan, you're nothing, and all of that. And that showed their extreme arrogance. Extreme arrogance. But holy angels, Psalm 8:5 is God has made man a little lower than what? The angels. God has made man a little lower than the angels. Can't get any more clear than that. All right. Now we won't get into the 1 Corinthians passage about do you not
I
believe?
was thinking too, I said, well, if the angels referred to God's authority before rebuking somebody, who are we? We shouldn't even think about that.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point from 2 Peter. Is that the angels, Michael the archangel, who rules over all the angels and has authority over Satan, doesn't use his own authority. He goes directly to the Lord. The Lord rebuke you. That's exactly the point. That's humility, right? Which is interesting. It gets into what's the definition of humility. I may actually have skipped over it. Definition of humility is not primarily a weak handshake or slouched shoulders or looking down at the ground or we're not talking about yourself. That's part of it. The primary point of humility is submission to authority. Submission to authority. And not just in a gritting your teeth kind of way, but in a I'm going to do it because it's right. That's the way God designed it. Right? And there's all different kinds of authority. All these authorities still exist. To the government, there's a certain submission to the government, and angels, and we're going to get into God himself. So does everyone see so far the evidence, the invisible authority, or at least understand it, from mankind and sin, angels within themselves, and now between mankind and angels? Now, there's also evidence between angels and God. Now, we haven't talked about that. Angels and God. All right. Hebrews 1, Hebrews 1, verses 4 to 6. Actually, the first chapter of Hebrews is all about how the Son, Jesus the Son, is superior to angels. Superior to angels. The entire book of Hebrews can be summed up as how the Son is superior. And each couple chapters, he's dealing with how the Son is superior. Because the problem was that they were slipping back into Judaism for whatever reason. Not the point. But chapter 1 is how the Son is superior to angels. And part of that is that he has become much better than angels. This is the verse. Having become as much better than angels, he has inherited a more excellent name than they. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you"? We're not going to talk about what that means yet. And again, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he again brings the firstborn into the world, speaking of the Son, he says, "And let all the angels of God worship him." The Son of God, God the Son, second person of the Trinity, has authority over angels to such a degree that they're going to worship him. Okay? Are angels going to worship us? Is this going to be shared with us? No. The Son has authority over angels. Okay? That's why he's better than they are. Okay? Angels submit to God. Period. All right. You can also see this in the Spirit of the Son, but also in the service of angels to God generally. Hebrews 1:7. In other words, you normally don't serve one that you don't have authority over. Anyway, of the angels he says, "Who makes his angels winds, his ministers flames of fire? And are they not ministering spirits sent out to render service?" Notice it says, God makes them servants. He makes them servants. It's not that they willingly do it because they have more authority and they're just being, showing a humility, I guess you could say, a lowering of themselves. No, God makes them his servants and he sends them out. Interesting. Angels, the service of angels show that God has authority over angels. How about this? The subjugation, in other words, just the suppressing of fallen angels and Satan. Matthew 8:29. It's interesting. This is a very interesting passage. When Jesus goes and it's about the herd of pigs and legion, we sort of know this story. And this is the demons. And they cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Son of God?" In other words, it's Jesus the Son. "Have you come to torment us before the time?" Now, this gets into a very specific aspect of God's authority over angels. As God has authority over angels, authority means the right to judge and to execute sentence. Right? So here it is, we see that the Son has authority over demons to the point that he can send them, if he wanted to, immediately into eternal torment. Okay? They knew there was a time at which it was appointed for them to be tormented. Jesus had the right and authority to send them immediately into that, because he's God, but he didn't. He sent them into the pigs instead. But here, we see again, the Son has authority over angels. And authority includes the definition of to judge and execute sentence. How about 2 Peter 2:4? Avery covered this. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. Notice, God over angels, he executes sentence and casts them into hell. Committed them to prince of darkness. This is an immediate judgment. They sinned. They weren't allowed to go out into the earth or whatever and do anything else. They were immediately bound and put into hell, and that's where they... And by the way, the word hell there is Tartarus. It's not the normal word for hell. It's Tartarus, meaning the reason why it's used is to show a special place reserved for these angels which are not getting out. That's it. They're there. And that's what probably is referring to in Matthew 8:29. To come commence with time. These angels already know that God has authority in all these things, and God has subjected some already into Tartarus. They're at this day, from when they sinned until this day, they are in Tartarus suffering the just penalty for their sin because God is an authority over them. All right, next, Jude 6. Same thing, angels, this is just a parallel verse. The angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment of the great day. Same thing, word a little different. Also Revelation 20:10, what's going to be happening? And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. In other words, you ask the question, are God and Satan equal? The answer is no. Satan is God's devil. God is an authority over him. And we know he's going to take him and take that authority and bring it to an end. And the authority includes the execution of sentence upon Satan. Or, how about something more abstract? We can see that God is an authority over angels in the abstraction of will. Think about this. Can the will of angels, fallen angels, or holy angels, be more powerful than the will of God? Okay? Which one has more authority? Romans 8:38. We quote it all the time, but let's bring it into the aspect of authority. We can see that God is an authority over angels in the aspect of pure will. For I am convinced, this is about the love of God, we know this verse, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, referring to holy angels, nor principalities, referring to fallen angels, are able to separate us from, the list goes on, are able to separate us from the love of God, right? That's the point. In other words, there's a will of God in the decision to love, to rescue, to redeem. And the authority that God has in his will over angels is not to be superseded. He hasn't permitted it, whether it's holy or fallen. Okay? From the ability to command angelic armies, that's Matthew 26:53. We made the point that angels are arranged. We see how they're arranged within themselves. But also, the same verse is used to show that Jesus Christ, the Son, has authority over angelic armies. Right? He's the Lord of hosts. That's Hebrew, Yahweh Tsebaoth, Lord of armies. Lord of armies. And it's angelic armies. He's the one that commands the armies to do his will. Okay? He's the general. Right? That's why in some of our songs, he's the God of angelic armies. That sort of phrase comes out. That is entirely biblical. You sort of skirt around that fact, but Jesus Christ commands angelic armies. He's an authority over them as God. From the title of God, I just mentioned it, Yahweh Tsebaoth. This comes from Psalm 24:10. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. He is the King of glory. In other words, is part of God's glory, the way that, in other words, is in the design of God, the reason why he created angels was to show his glory. His showing authority over them and arranging them in military order and conquering, in a sense, is to show his glory. What's more glory? What's one way? When you see angels in greater command than us, greater power and being, and they submit and worship, and he has complete authority over them, that's glorious. It's glorious. He's the King of that glory. Okay. Now finally, so we've done invisible realm, right? Sin, mankind to sin, angels within themselves, God and angels. What about man and angels? Man and angels. Or sorry, man and God. Man and God. Well, James 4:7. Submit therefore to God. The word submit. It's a command. 1 Peter 5:6. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Humble yourselves, and that's where the idea is that humility. I'm going to read my notes. Humility is not primarily identified by the gentleness of a disposition, the firmness of a handshake, the pliability to do what others want. It's not tolerance. Humility is primarily a submission to authority with appropriate behavior and attitude. Humility is submission to an authority. From the analogy of headship. In other words, we can see how God and man relate in the analogy or in the metaphor in the New Testament or anywhere of headship. 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. Now, we're not interpreting that section. But here it says, Christ is the head of every man. Okay? He's in authority. From the titles of God. Titles of God. King of kings, Lord of lords. Those are very interesting titles, by the way. We'll talk about the Hebrew later when we actually get into theology proper, which is after bibliology. It's coming up very much more sooner than these other topics. But titles of God, the word Lord, right? In fact, the name of God himself, how he revealed it. Who here knows what the name of God is? If you want to, what is it?
The first one,
Yeah, the name of God, not the title.
I am.
I am. Now, what does that mean? Anybody know what that means? Anybody know what that means? If you know what it means, good. You can just shout it out. You're on tape.
I exist.
No, it doesn't mean I exist.
Self-existent?
Nope. That's part. It could go that way, but that's not the way it's interpreted by Paul in Romans 9.
Well, I think he means I am the ultimate authority.
That's right. I will do what I will
Go,
do.
Miss Francis.
That's right. I am who I am. I will have mercy. Notice, he says, I am. Tell him, I am have sent you. I am have sent you. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will harden whom I harden. His name is not primarily about his existence, but is about his sovereignty. His very name reveals the fact that God is sovereign. God's authority. All right. I include that under titles, even though that should be under the name of God. From the principle of worship. In other words, how do we see that mankind is under the authority of God? Well, principle of command, principle of the analogy of headship, titles of God, the principle of worship. Does God worship us? No, we worship God. Worship, the entire process of worship includes the understanding of submission to authority, which is why if the understanding of that is not included in worship, in our hearts, then it's just vain worship. Right? That's why obedience, notice, that's why what you do the rest of the week, I got 2 minutes, that's why what you do the rest of the week in obedience to God's commands versus what you do on Sunday can be, if they're completely opposite from one another, it shows that the heart is not worshiping because worship is about submission to an authority.
I want to say, when he said that about humility is submission to authority.
Yeah.
Like when we sin, and let's use two great examples for men and for women. Women struggle with gossip, right, more times than men, not always. Men struggle with sexual lust, thinking. When a man thinks like that about a woman, and when a woman gossips, there's such pride and arrogance because what we're doing is we're not submitting to God saying, don't look at women that way, don't gossip. We're saying, you know what, God, I know better than you. I can gossip. I can talk about that. I'm not going to submit to your authority. So the root of sin is pride, arrogance. Okay, and I think when we start seeing sin that way and understanding this authority that God has over us, I think it's like it's an arrow in our quiver. Is that right? Is that what that thing that holds your arrows? It's an arrow to help us fight sin, to see that we're, because who wants to be arrogant and prideful? We don't want to be. And when we see, hey, that's exactly what I'm being, I think it helps us submit to the authority of God and therefore fight against that sin.
Exactly. One last point. and then we're going to stop. We'll stop here for today. How else can you see that God is an authority over mankind? Well, here's the thing. For the ability to judge permanently. Notice, God is authority. One of the reasons why we show that God had authority over the angels is that he could judge immediately and permanently. One of the ways that God has authority over mankind, as we see, is that God has the ability to judge permanently mankind, individually, corporately, whatever. And no one's going to take it from him, right? And there are two kinds of people in hell, right? The weeping and the gnashing of teeth. It's amazing what those phrases mean. It doesn't mean they're repenting. It means they're either sorry for themselves or they hate the fact that the God is crushing them. They're gnashing. But God, it says, do not fear those who kill the body but are able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. God has authority over mankind as creator to judge, and there's nothing you can do about it. Everyone's going to die, and after that, what? The judgment. God is judge. Everyone's going to stand before him, which is why the gospel is so important. That authority cannot be stripped away. It's not voted in office. It's not going to change. It's there, and God has it. We don't. That's it. All right. Any questions on this morning about how authority exists in the visible and in the invisible realm? There are also Trinitarian rules we're going to talk about next week. Evidence from intra-Trinitarian. Intra means within the Trinity. How the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit relate to each other. We're going to look at how authority exists even there.